It's not necessarily about rent stabilized units get rent freezes. It's about who gets those rent freezes.
The Weekly Friedman, your source for the most essential information in the default industry. With your host, Adam Friedman.
The New York City mayoral campaign is heating up, especially as it relates to affordable housing. Former Governor Andrew Cuomo proposed Zohran's Law. Now, this is a means testing requirement for rent-stabilized apartments aimed at excluding higher-income New Yorkers from these units. I'm joined today by Burcu Eroglu, who's going to help us walk through this proposal. How's it going?
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
To be clear, to make sure our viewers don't get confused, as a reminder, you probably heard it in my intro, but I want to just highlight it here. Cuomo's proposal is called Zohran's Law. Zohran Mamdani also has a proposal. So when we refer to Zohran's Law, we're going to be referring to Cuomo's proposal. This is a proposal, but it's directed at one individual, right? So who is this directed at?
So this bill or this proposal is essentially targeted at his main political opponent at this time, Zohran Mamdani. And the reason for coining it Zohran's Law is because Zohran himself lives in a rent-stabilized unit in Astoria, Queens, and makes $140,000 a year.
How can someone who makes $140,000 a year live in a rent-stabilized apartment?
So there's a number of different ways in which you can do it, but primarily some of the ways that we could achieve a higher income tenant living in a rent-stabilized unit is through succession laws and rent renewals.
So walk me through this. If somebody leases a rent-stabilized apartment because they satisfy the income requirement, right, they're below a certain threshold, and then they make considerably more money over a period of time, there's a mechanism that enables them to just stay in the apartment?
Essentially, yes. And I think that kind of leads into the actual principle behind why rent stabilization laws were created. It was essentially intended to ensure tenant longevity, to build that community up and to ensure that tenants don't actually leave in a rental community, which I think is almost counterintuitive to Cuomo's proposal, which makes means testing essentially a basis for welfare, as opposed to the ultimate real reason why rent-stabilized policies were created.
If I'm a landlord and I'm restricted on what I could charge, you see the logic when it's a lower income individual. But to be restricted on what I could charge in a scenario where the tenant is potentially making more than the landlord is kind of troublesome, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think you touch on a really, really good issue that critics are also highlighting, both with respect to Mamdani's proposal and also with respect to Andrew Cuomo's proposal. The first one is with respect to units, especially in mixed housing buildings, where part of the units are not actually rent stabilized. And so you create this discrepancy between some units which are rent stabilized and have a fixed rental increase per year and others within the same building that actually don't. So it creates this unfair advantage towards those rent-stabilized tenants, towards their literal neighbors. And another reason for that is also you're creating a issue with respect to tenants that are defined as the middle class. So for example, with Zohran's Law, it's means testing that would require 30% of your income or more annual income to qualify for certain rent-stabilized apartment. To give an example, that would be if a tenant makes $100,000, 30% of that would allow them to live in an apartment that goes for $2,500 per month. However, it disqualifies a tenant that makes $105,000 per year. They would no longer be eligible to qualify for a rent-stabilized unit under Zohran's Law because they're $5,000 over that threshold amount.
To further complicate this, Mamdani is proposing no increases over a number of years, which I think when you first hear that proposal, you understand it. He's attempting to support his base, maybe lower income individuals. Do you think it's a conflict of interest that he's actually living in a rent-stabilized apartment and makes more than the average lower income rent stabilization occupant?
I think prima facie, or on its face, it absolutely looks hypocritical. That being said, Mamdani is looking to create a longer rent stabilization policy for tenants across New York City that doesn't just last with his tenure as mayor. It would involve multifaceted approach. Number one being an instant rent freeze, as you correctly stated, but he's also looking to lobby in Albany, where he would ultimately strive to enforce rent stabilization laws in statutes so that even after his tenure is over, these rent stabilization laws stay.
What do you think would happen if there was no rent stabilization?
I think that's a complicated question. That being said, the market itself would become pretty volatile if we were to have no sense of control over how units are being rented out. I think it's extremely worth noting that landlords are generally struggling right now to keep up with overhead costs. Prices of everything are going up. So as a result, it makes sense that landlords are increasing rent and that they're struggling to maintain those overhead costs. So that translating to increased rent is not out of the realm of possibilities.
What are the critics of Cuomo's proposal saying about the proposal?
One of the critiques that Zohran's law especially faces is with respect to his means testing from a compliance perspective. Essentially, landlords would be tasked with ensuring that every single tenant that is in a rent-stabilized unit meets that 30% threshold. And in order to do that, that essentially translates to more paperwork for landlords. And landlords are already inundated with a number of different tasks that they need to do in order to keep these buildings afloat. Adding one more thing might be one thing too much.
Right, I agree. I think that one thing you see with a lot of legislation is something gets put out there that maybe serves the desires or the goal of the proposer. But when you initiate all these difficult compliance demands, it becomes unsustainable.
One advantage for Zohran's law as it relates to, I think, the palatability towards landlords is that the implementation trigger wouldn't occur unless a tenant occupies a vacant apartment. So it is only triggered essentially upon vacancy, whereas Mamdani's proposal would take effect regardless of vacancy status. The means testing policies that Cuomo's trying to implement only applies to currently vacant apartments. So if anyone is trying to occupy that vacant apartment, they would be subject to means testing. What it doesn't apply to are people who are already in rent-stabilized units when the law is passed. Mamdani's proposal essentially creates a foundation whereby Cuomo's proposal is a filter upon that foundation that Mamdani is creating. It's not necessarily about rent-stabilized units get rent freezes. It's about who gets those rent freezes.
Naturally, the voter, when they hear these ideas, they think about how it affects them and how it aligns with their social political beliefs. But as you're kind of helping me see in this conversation, there's so many economic results from who wins and how it relates to this specific issue. You really see how nuanced this is. What I'd love to hear from viewers are their thoughts. Put politics aside. Depending on who wins here, how do you feel like this will impact the economics of New York City? Because I think that's the real big takeaway here, is that the winner of this election and how they treat affordable housing will have a great, great impact on the city.
Thanks for joining Adam Friedman and Burcu Eroglu on the Weekly Friedman, your source for the most essential information in the default industry. Thanks for tuning in and looking forward to seeing you next time.